Hey, welcome to the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We are in week 54. We are going to be in Deuteronomy 31, 32, and 33, Psalms 54, and Luke 11. Whew, that's a mouthful.
That is.
You know what? The very first time I ever introduced the podcast, it took me 3 takes to say the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. And now it just comes off my lips so smoothly.
And I can attest that this is take one.
It is take
Perfect
one.
the first time.
Nailed it. We are in this. If you haven't picked this up, you can get it from the church office. There also is a digital copy of this online. So
fbcr.org/thewell.
And I'll do my best to put them in the show notes.
All right.
If I don't forget. Awesome. There you go. Pick that up for you. Craig, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Should be good. We're kind of coming up on the last section of Deuteronomy here. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy chapters 31 through 34, the last 4 chapters of Deuteronomy, in a sense, mirror the first 3 chapters of Deuteronomy 1 through 3, especially with the commissioning of Joshua to lead the Israelites into the land.
Yeah, this is a really interesting section. It's like all of a sudden, it's like passing a baton happening. And Joshua is going to become the new Moses.
He does. And we have this very specific and orderly transfer in leadership of the Israelite people from Moses to Joshua. And I picked up on these patterns just reading through these chapters in preparation for what Joshua will be going through. Divine leadership is incarnational. It's earth and human leaders. God bestows his leadership through his Spirit upon certain people, especially through the Old Testament. And we know this continues in Christians in the New Testament. But there's a sense that Joshua has to be instilled with this authority before the people of God can proceed into the promised land. Secondly, Joshua is no doubt overawed and anxious about this mantle of leadership he's getting from Moses. So God continues, and Moses continues to prep him through this repeated phrase that, at least I just picked up on this phrase the first time today, and it continues into the first chapters of Joshua. Be strong and of good courage. This is something we've all heard in at least in the church tradition, but this is really specific to Joshua and must deal with the anxiety he feels in these big shoes he's got to fill with taking over from Moses.
They are big shoes. I was thinking the same thing. Moses is the first person to see God's glory.
Yeah.
I mean, he was closest. He was so close that in a lot of different places in the Pentateuch, it talks about he is like friends. He's talking face to face. That's about as close as anyone has gotten.
It's as far as, this is the guy that's freed the whole Israelite people from Egypt. He's led them to freedom. He's, even in the bad times in the desert and the good times in the desert for 40 years, Moses has been their leader. We just read through Deuteronomy. He's basically given Israel their formation charter, their constitution.
Yeah, their covenant. What does it look like to be a covenant people?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And God is doing all this through Moses. And Joshua is like, what? I'm supposed to step into that and do what?
Yeah.
That's a big responsibility.
It is. But remember, Moses, when we first were introduced to him, he wasn't so confident himself.
That's true. He had this sense of, why are you picking me, God? I'm just a stutterer. Maybe you should pick this guy over here.
Yeah.
Pick Aaron, my brother. He's better.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I actually also saw something in this section as well. I picked up on a few things that had to be put into place. It was like this. These are the things. Here's the maintenance that needs to happen before this baton is passed. I came up with a few things. The first one was in verse 3. The first thing that has to happen is the Lord himself has to go before them in the land. But then exactly the same line, verse 3 continues and says, and Joshua will go before them in the land. I was like, that's an interesting image that you have Yahweh. You have Yahweh as coming through, and then you have an image of Yahweh, because what does Joshua mean in Hebrew?
The Hebrew word is Yeshua, but it means God saves.
God's
salvation.
Which is going to be Jesus. So it's almost like here you have, in one line, you have Yahweh himself and an image of Jesus going before the people into the land in verse 3. I think that's a really beautiful image.
That's very cool.
And then the next thing that has to happen, we see it in verse 24, is Moses needs to finish writing down the Torah, the law that God has been giving him. He has to finish writing that down. And in verse 26, now the priests were in charge, the Levites were in charge of keeping that law and putting in the Ark of the Covenant. That was something that needs to be told. We were also told up in verse 10 that every 7 years, that very law would have to be read aloud and publicly as a reminder. Mind you, this law was a lot. Can you imagine having to sit there? And it says everyone, men, women, children, the sojourner, everybody has to be read to, all these laws. And the last thing that has to be done, in verse 19, it says that Moses was instructed to write this song, this poem, to serve as a reminder for all the generations to pass. And we're going to talk a lot about that poem today. So we should
probably get into it.
Yeah, we should.
Moving in, and it's in Deuteronomy 32. It actually starts and is set up in verses 30 and 32 of chapter 31. So closing out chapter 31, it sets up the poem as this treaty structure. Again, you'll see, we've talked about this before, how a lot of these, especially Deuteronomy stories and passages are set up as these treaty structures that were famous in the ancient Near East, and this is another one.
Yeah, what's interesting, before we get into this poem, you were talking about how Joshua needed to be strong and courageous, right? And in that same section, in chapter 31, it says Moses is speaking to the congregation as a whole. So before he speaks to Joshua, he speaks to the congregation, and Moses says, hey, y'all, don't have fear, because Yahweh's going to go before you in the land. Remember that. And he will not leave you, and he will not
forsake you.
It's like, you're ready. Like, you're ready for this point. I'm going to give it to you a few more times. In the very next line, now Moses is speaking to Joshua. He's telling Joshua the same thing. Be strong and courageous. God will be with you. He will never leave you or
forsake you.
I didn't pay you for this, but I appreciate it. And it says, do not fear, right? But if we skip down to verse 16 and 17. This was really interesting to me. Verses 16 and 17, it's now God is speaking to Moses. So before, Moses was speaking to the congregation. Then Moses was speaking directly to Joshua, encouraging him. And then now we see Yahweh speaking to Moses. And he's saying, hey, Moses, you are about to die. It literally says you are about to lay down. And when you do, your people are going to rise up. And when they rise up, they're going to rise up against me. And they're going to fail all the things we just talked about, keeping my commandments. They're not going to do it well. And when they do, they're going to forsake me. So, which is interesting because it just said to the congregation, God will never forsake you. Joshua, don't be afraid. God won't forsake you. And then it says a few lines later, Moses, when you lie down, they're going to rise up against me and they're going to forsake me. Therefore, verse 17 says, and I will forsake them. That is an interesting pondering thought.
I will forsake them, and mine, ESV continues, hide my face from them, and they will be devoured. So the way this strikes me, and we can see what you think about this, but the way it strikes me is there's this sense of divine abandonment that we've been talking about the last few weeks, and this is a growing theme that I'm aware of as we're about to head into Joshua, and we know. If you know anything about the Bible, you know the book of Joshua is the book that tells the story of the conquest of the land of Canaan, and it's very violent and a lot of problems and pushback and argumentation and debate that people have problems with Christianity about, and that they argue about with believers is why do you worship such a violent God that would command and order and enable such genocidal destruction as we see in the book of Joshua. We'll get there and we'll deal with that. But I think you're trying to do the same you have in the past weeks. I'm trying to plant seeds that there's a different sense of what might be going on here, just for you to consider, that there's this sense of when God is issuing judgment or when sin is at its full, God is going to withdraw himself because he can't be in the presence of sin and evil and tolerate that.
Yeah, we've been talking about this just to keep going further into this thought. We've been talking a lot about the fact that there's them choosing to not follow God is them choosing to forego all the blessings.
Right.
And when you don't receive the blessings, it's the opposite of that is the curses. The curses is them choosing to go back into what it looks like for God to hide his face.
And you call it decreation.
It's decreation. It's decreation. And it actually kind of reminds me, now that we're talking about it, it reminds me of when we had those conversations many, many months ago when we struggled with this idea and this concept of Pharaoh's heart being hardened versus God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Remember we had many discussions over that? Maybe you wrestled with it then. This is that same wrestling I think you should feel today. There's a difference between with Pharaoh is already going to do evil upon these people.
Right.
When it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it wasn't anything that Pharaoh wasn't already going to do. It was almost like he just sped up the process to be on God's timing for this whole book thing to play out, right? It was as if he's not doing anything that he wasn't already going to do himself. I think it's the same thing here. You got to pay attention to when it's God, what God is doing versus what he's allowing for them to put upon themselves. It's something that they were already evil and corrupt. He's just kind of maybe speeding up the process here.
And Paul talks about this in Romans 1. So this carries over into the New Testament. And ultimately we see this is what happens on the cross, without getting too far into that story today. But we know that Jesus quotes Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? God withdraws his holy presence because he can't be in the presence of the sin. So we get this sense that God is hiding. I'm going to hide my face from them. And we'll see this in the Song of Moses in Exodus. Sorry, I keep saying Exodus. And Deuteronomy 32 as well.
We've been away from Exodus for a while now, Greg.
We have. I don't know why I'm still wanting to go back there.
That's okay. I say Jacob and Joseph wrong every time, and you have to correct me, so it's fine.
It's fair.
It's fair. So what's interesting, I had two thoughts, but I lost one, so we're going to the second one. That happens. My second thought was about this anger and how you talked about how it's about this hiding his face. Yeah. For some reason that stood out to me. So what I did is I looked back, Craig, and I was like, when is the first time we see God's anger kindling? So I'm asking you a question. Ready for this? When is the first time in the Pentateuch that in all of our studies together did we finally see God's anger being kindled? Do you have any idea?
I think maybe, so I got a couple of incidents in the first chapters of Genesis that go through my head. I don't know if this is right or not. This is just my
I will correct you. It's fine.
Honest first reaction, gut reaction. I think of the flood and his anger against the people that he wants to wipe out because his heart grieves within him that he created humans. Or it's the Tower of Babel is the other one I think of.
Okay. No.
Okay, I'm wrong on both accounts.
Both of those, he has like regret or despair over what they were doing is the words that's used. It does not talk about his anger at all.
Okay.
The first time we see God's anger, his anger towards his people, is going to be at the burning bush with Moses.
Really?
You ready for this? So at the Moses story, he's trying to get Moses to take over this leadership. We already talked about it, remember? Yep. Moses didn't think he was eloquent with his words, slow with his speech. Yep. And so God was like, but who creates words? Who gives you a mouth? Who gives you the ability to speak? Lean on me and I'll give it to you. And he goes, but Lord, could you please give it to someone else? Somebody else do it. And he says, God's anger was kindled on Moses. First time you ever see it in the scriptures.
Wow.
And he says, don't you have a brother named Aaron? So here's the interesting part. His anger is kindled, but he didn't have his retribution. There wasn't any. What happened was he said, go get your brother.
He accommodated,
right?
Yeah.
Now we speed up here. Oh, and then don't forget, Aaron is the one who does the blessing over Israel. And Aaron's blessing is the famous one that Ellis says all the time in the end of our services, which I wrote it down because Ellis does it by memory and I would not be able to. Aaron's blessing is in number 6, and it says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So what you see the first time we see his anger kindled with Moses. Moses gets his brother Aaron, right? Aaron is the one who blesses the people with what? God will shine his face. Yeah. Here, his anger is kindled. What does he do with his face?
He's going to hide it.
He hides it.
Yeah.
Do you see the opposite here?
Yep.
Isn't that really fascinating?
That is amazing.
And
it reminds me of the way the early church fathers talked about this. If you've read some of the early church history writings, they talk about the way they talked about wanting to know God was seeking the face of God.
Exactly.
And I hadn't thought about that until you just brought that up.
Yeah, it's this opposite. So Aaron's blessing, when God shines his face on you, it's an intimacy. It's a closeness, right? Beautiful. Now you've chosen to forsake me. You've chosen to the curses. You've put it upon yourself. I'm going to hide my blessing. So that intimacy, that closeness is gone.
Wow.
That all kind of stirred up in me, and I was like, it just brought some light bulbs for me. Hope that's helpful to y'all as you go along. Okay, we're going to do something we haven't done before.
I'm going to read scripture.
We're going to read the entire poem together. We talked about this beforehand. I kind of dumped this on you last second, so thank you for doing it.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to try to explore this the Song of Moses in chapter 32. I set it up with the last verses of chapter 31 coming in at 32, but let's dig into the poem itself.
Let's do it. I call this Moses's. That's a hard word today. I call this Moses' Magnum Opus. This is his final work, his most important work.
And I would say this, combined with his blessing to the Israelite tribes in 33 as a unit, I would totally agree with that.
Yeah.
This is literally his last words.
It really is. It's super neat. So let's go ahead and go through this together. I think we should just start in verse 1.
Right.
And we're just going to break through and see how much we can get out of this poem. It is poem. It is a poetry. The language is supposed to make you think, right? There's pieces to be picked up, and we're going to see so much. Remember, Deuteronomy is the mirrored image of Genesis. So we're going to see a lot of Genesis in here, which of course is my favorite.
Yep.
So here we go. We're digging in.
All right.
Craig's going to help read, and we're going to together go through some of this stuff.
Sounds
so
good. And just stop me where you want to jump in.
1 through 3.
So give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God.
That's beautiful language.
Yeah, it really is.
It's almost like he's describing his law, his word, as something that brings life. Brings life.
And this is very worshipful language too.
It is. It's beautiful.
Reverent.
Just because I think law brings life, I always think of the kind of Eden life imagery, right? All these languages are things that are growing, and I always think of Eden when I think of these images. Beautiful. Verse 4, the rock, his work is perfect. The rock here is the very first time that is talk about Jesus is described as the rock. It's the first time. Now, we talked about it as a metaphor back when Moses struck the rock.
Right.
We made some connections, but this was one of the connections we made. It didn't directly say Jesus as the rock. That was us using a metaphor. Yeah. This is the first time it actually says the rock. And this is a prophetic view of Jesus here, which is really neat. This word perfect here, his work is perfect. This word perfect actually is tamim, the word tamim. Tamim means whole or complete or perfect. And the reason why I bring this up, because it's going to be fruitful later.
Okay.
No pun on words. Fruitful later.
Laying a seed.
Laying a seed. Remember the word perfect, tamim. Okay? Keep going.
Second half of that verse. Yep. For all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without inequity, just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. So right there, that word blemish there, the word blemish is moom. M-O-O-M is how you pronounce it. Moom. What's interesting about that is that's the word that means spot or defect, right? Or blemish. Yep. But when you put those two things together, when you have that God is like, his justice is perfect and is sacrifice language. So it's an animal that was bring sacrificially had to be temain with no moom. So without blemish. Without blemish. Yeah. This is the opposite. This is saying God's justice is perfect, but his people are with blemish. Interesting. So we're having this sacrifice language here put together, which is so neat. And also in verse 5, when he's dealt corruptly with him, that word corruptly is the same word that is used for Genesis 6 when the earth was corrupt before God. Okay. Yeah, it's that same word. So it's almost bringing the entire creation into this sense of corruptness. That's exactly what we're supposed to imagine. Interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. in the last part of 5 there, they are a crooked and twisted generation. Jesus used just this language in the last week or two, right, in Luke.
He did.
Talking about this how long do I have to deal with this twisted, crooked generation?
Yeah, you see it a lot actually in the New Testament, picked up several different times. Yeah.
Continue with 6.
Yeah, just do it.
Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your Father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples, according to the numbers of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage.
All right, that's a long section there. What do we think about all this? It's like saying, remember the days of old, meaning that since Abraham till now, the days of old is kind of this phrase that just means from Abraham to now. Sometimes this phrase can be described throughout the Bible as eternity, but I don't think that's what it means here. I think here it's talking about like Abraham until now, this generation of people is what it's talking about. And it's talking about when you skip down to the divided mankind, this is the Babylon language. Babylon language.
It also occurs to me, we have this mix of the names for God, the Most High, up ahead, which is, behind that is the word Elion, which is a more general name for God. And that's used in Genesis 1, I believe. And then we get down to this sense of the Lord's, in verse 9, the Lord's portion. That's the Hebrew name, the name, Yahweh, that most Jewish believers wouldn't say the name. So in our Bibles, it's translated the Lord. So you get the sense of, in verse 8, it's the more universal sense of God and dealing with all the peoples and how he fixed their borders. And then getting specific in verse 9, that this is the Lord of Israel, and it's the same Lord dealing with Israel and his allotted heritage.
And it has a different word there.
Yep, exactly. Different name for God.
I love that. I love that you picked up on those little details. Yep. This section right here, it says, according to the number of the sons of God. That's an interesting little section here, sons of God. It's the sons of El. There are some translations that actually would do the sons of Israel. And it basically, Israel versus sons of El is literally the plus or minus of 3 Hebrew letters. Yeah. So it's we don't know which one it is. Most people actually believe that son of El, that's what the ESV I have does. That's probably the most earliest version we have is sons of El. But what does that mean? That's kind of confusing, the sons of El. I have a thought. What do you have?
So a couple things. It could literally mean just we're sons of God. These are children of God in the sense that God created everybody. But there's also this callback to Genesis 6 that uses the phrase sons of God.
It does. Genesis 6 has this phrase where it was talking about, we talked about it before, of these kind of these fallen angels, like these hybrid. I like to call them hybrid angels, hybrids, because they're kind of half sons of El, but they're also breeding with women, human women. So they're between the breeding of the sons of El and the human women, they create these giant men, these warrior kings, right? These giant warrior kings.
And remember when Moses sent the advanced scouting party into the promised land, they came back claiming that giants were in the land. They were afraid.
They were afraid. Yeah. There's the Nephilim again. Yeah. The Nephilim, right?
Which I can never pronounce that either.
Nephilim. I always had to tell you. What's interesting is right before this, we have them talk about the scattering and the division of mankind. That is referencing Babylon. What's interesting about Babylon is Babylon was defeated because of a giant warrior king named I said it earlier today, now it's gone. Nimrod. Named Nimrod. Nimrod actually, this giant warrior king actually is claimed to be one of the Nephilim. So there's this pattern here where you're talking about from the snake in the garden to these fallen angel spirit hybrid things that mate with the women, and then you have these warrior kings that are the ones that are splitting up and divided into the nations. You have all these images. So when you see these words, you're supposed to kind of bring back all these images that you've been developing throughout. This is this mirroring of Genesis here. It's super interesting. I hope that's helpful.
Well,
Or maybe
it is to me.
maybe it brought more questions, and if it did, dig in.
Yeah.
If it brought more questions, that's good, because I've had to wrestle with these questions for a long time.
One thing I've learned through this journey is you're going to find God in the questions. Like
That's
when
it.
it becomes difficult, you should celebrate. You should get excited because that's when God is wanting you to dig in to find something more.
That's exactly right. I agree. Amen to that.
Yep. Verse 10, right?
Verse 10. So what's interesting is this is like, okay, keep going. I know what this is.
Okay. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He circled him, he cared for him, he kept him in the apple of his eye.
Let's stop right there for a second. So he found him in the desert land. Who's him? First of all, I think it can mean a couple things.
He just talked about Jacob,
Okay.
as his allotted heritage. So given context, I would say Jacob or Israel.
Israel, that's the point.
Yeah.
So Jacob, mind you, anytime, this is poetry.
Yeah.
So anytime you see the word Jacob, Jacob is the father of Israel.
Right.
So this can represent his people, like
Right.
the people of Israel. So I think this is what you're talking about. He found his
Jacob
people.
was renamed Israel, right?
He was.
Yeah.
And towards the end there, you didn't know which one he was going to be
Right.
described.
That's right.
Sometimes in one paragraph it will say Jacob and then Israel. And I kind of started pinning it when it said Jacob is because he wasn't doing something
I
right.
remember you saying that.
Yeah, and then when he said Israel, he was like doing something right in the same paragraph.
Well, he's Israel who's living into his new identity.
That's right. We
Yeah.
remember talking about that.
Yep.
That was a long time ago. So I think here he found his people, the Israelites, in the desert land. Where was that? Where do you think we're talking about here?
In Egypt.
In the wilderness.
Yeah.
Like they're in the wilderness here.
Yeah.
And they're in the wilderness. This is after they've crossed. And now the howling wasteland. So this is word wasteland here. You have two images here. You have his people that are represented into the wilderness, but you also have this image of this pre-creation state. Remember, the pre-creation state is this wasteland of desolate chaos.
Formless and void.
Formless and void.
Yeah.
It's this one word here. The howling wasteland is the same word used in the pre-creation state. So you have these people who are supposed to be kind of represented as kind of being in this desolate place, right? This pre-creation state. And then it says, he reached them and cared for them. While they were in the wilderness, they cared for them, and he kept them as the apple of his eye. What does that mean? That's an English turn of phrase, by the way. This is not a Hebrew turn of phrase. So I looked it up. What does that mean in a Hebrew turn of phrase? It literally means tiny human of the eye.
Really?
Tiny human. Here's
So
why.
funny.
You ready for this? Craig, you're going to get close to me, okay? Ready? Get closer to me. Can you see your reflection
I can.
of yourself in my
In your
eye?
eye, yeah.
Is it a tiny you?
It is.
That's
It's
what
like
it means.
Like a mirror.
It's a tiny you. So this is what it means literally in Hebrew. He cared for them so intimately that he was so close to them in proximity that it was like you could see himself in their eye.
Very interesting.
Tiny human in the eye.
I just looked this up, and in the complete Jewish Bible, which is trying to get to a more literal Jewish translation, it's still English, but they're trying to translate it closer to what maybe the idioms are in the Hebrew. The back half of verse 10, he protected him and cared for him, guarded him like the pupil of his eye. So
Pupil
you have
is
the
eye.
pupil. Yeah.
So the same thing. Because the eye, the word eye is there. We changed apple for some reason as it's tiny human.
Yeah.
That's
interesting.
The image, I don't even know what apple of your eye even means in the English turn of phrase. Like if you said that, I wouldn't even know.
Yeah. Well, you talk about so-and-so was the apple of his eye.
What does that mean?
Like I think it means he's
You
like,
adore them?
he's really high up there in his esteem. He really puts him up on a shelf. He's the.
I thought it was more like you adore something. Like,
I think that too.
My little sweet girl, she's the apple of my eye.
I think that too.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
I've seen both.
I actually know the Hebrew better than the English here.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Which I know neither, so.
No, I don't either.
We're going to defer to Amber on this.
No,
because
not at all.
She knows.
This is my favorite part about this section right here. I'm going to get there. I'm going to read the next section. It says, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, it flutters over their young, spreading out its wing and catches them. Here's the thing about the word flutter. It is not flutter. It's a bad translation. It's the same exact word as hovering. Hold on. Do you remember in the pre-creation state, you have the empty and void, right? Yeah. What is the very next thing in the creation story? What hovers?
The Spirit of God.
The Spirit of God hovers. This is what's happening right here. It says, like an eagle, God like an eagle, the Spirit is hovering over its young.
Yeah.
You're supposed to have this image of the Holy Spirit hovering over the people as they go through the wilderness.
Yeah.
Oh, I just got goosebumps. It's so good stuff.
That's
awesome. Okay, verse 12.
The Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the high places of the land, and he ate the produce of the field. And he suckled him with honey out of the rock and oil out of the flinty rock. We have an illusion there of the water coming out of the rock again.
Yeah, so the honey out of the rock is just, it's a poem, right? It
Yeah.
means the water. It means the water.
Yeah.
It's just, it's supposed to sound poetic. Keep going. Let's go all the way through 14 and then we'll be...
Sorry, I think I lost my place here.
It's okay.
We picked up in 14?
Yeah.
Curds from the herd and milk from the flock, with fat of lambs, rams of Bashan and goats, with the very finest of the wheat, and you drank foaming wine made from the blood of the grapes.
Interesting, right? This language here, I think what we're supposed to imagine here is that the people, so they're in the wilderness, right? They're in the wilderness. God's spirit is hovering over them. He's taking care of them to the point that it's describing like a royal feast. You're supposed to, like, that's how well they're taken care of, like a royal feast. Anyone else out in the desert, if they were worshiping other gods, they would have died out there.
Yeah.
The other gods could not have provided the way that God did in the wilderness.
Because those gods are lifeless.
They're lifeless. They can't provide. So he's saying, if you worship other gods, you would have died out there. But instead, you didn't die, and you had a royal feast. You had all these things.
That's helpful. I'm not sure I connected those. I went reading through that. Verse 15, right?
I think of Psalms 23, by the way.
Oh, that's great.
Psalms 23. If you read Psalms 23, you'll make the connection with the royal feast there.
Yeah.
Keep going, sorry.
Verse 15, but Jeshurun grew fat and kicked.
What's up with there? What is Jeshurun?
I have no idea. I was having a tough time just pronouncing it.
Well, that actually is a nickname. It's a nickname for Israel.
Okay.
And it's supposed to be sarcasm here.
Oh, really?
It's supposed to be sarcasm. It actually means the upright one. The name means the upright one. Here's why it's sarcasm. Because this whole time, who's been the upright one? God is, and his people are not.
Yeah.
This is a sarcastic nickname. What's interesting is Isaiah will actually pick up on this,
Oh, really?
and he'll use the same term in sarcasm as well. So when we get to Isaiah, we'll see this nickname again, which is super cool.
It almost reminds me of the opposite of you stiff-necked people that God will call them later.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It's like stiff neck is not necessarily sarcasm, but it's a great.
But it's the
nickname.
opposite kind of
Yes.
this. If he's being playful here,
That's right.
but stiff-necked people is a serious turn of that phrase.
Yes, and it's just like that. It's a nickname for the people of God.
It's almost like, okay, I'm not kidding anymore. You sniff-necked people.
Yeah, exactly. And so we just had a royal feast right above it, and now in verse 15, but this is how the reaction. This is the response.
But you grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God, who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation.
Rock of salvation.
Yeah.
There's Jesus.
Yep. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominations that provoked him to anger. Carried on in 17. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods that they had never known, to new gods that they had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were verse 18. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth.
This whole section is just reiterating the rejection. He's done all these things for them. They got fat and they had all the food they wanted. They had all the things they needed completely provided for, and yet they rejected him. This section is supposed to be about rejection. The next section is, and since they rejected him, hear how he's provoked.
The Lord saw it and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom there is no faithfulness.
There you go. There's that. When he's provoked into anger, one of the ways that looks is for him turning and hiding his face.
Yeah. Yep.
Instead of his shining.
Just like we talked about it earlier in chapter 31.
Yeah, and this perverse generation, this is another word for idolatry. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Verse 21, they have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. So
right here we have, this is their rejection, and now he's saying, you'll see a lot of phrases like, so I will, so I will, so I will. What I think I want this next section, I don't have a lot of notes other than the fact that I want, as you read this next section, pay attention to a couple things. Pay attention when the things is God doing it versus the things when God's allowing them to bring it upon themselves.
Yeah.
Pay attention to that as we read further into it. And you had something here.
I'll say in verse 21 that turn of phrase of no God compared to no peoples. I thought that was really interesting, and that's even more of a direct play on words in the original Hebrew. In verse 21, they have made me jealous by no God. that the Hebrew there is lo el, Loel, el being the word for God and lo being the word for no. And then semicolon, I will make them jealous by a no people, lo am, Loam.
Yeah.
So we get the sense of a prophetic view into what God does through the Gentiles through and after Jesus to make, and Paul talks about this in Romans 9 through 11, right? When he talks about the state of the Jewish people after Jesus and after they reject Jesus and what God is doing to the Gentiles to bring them to full jealousy. So we get that played out with this prophecy right here.
Yeah, you're reminding me that it's interesting. So many of these poems in the Pentateuch are so prophetic. They are. And I was going back, I was thinking about this when we were talking, and as I was studying this week, I was like, how many poems have I come across in the Pentateuch?
Not a lot, right?
Not that many, and they've all been really prophetic. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting how these...
And you're calling forth a few of them, right?
Yeah, the ones that I came up with was Jacob's. I said it right. I didn't say Joseph this time. Jacob's poem at the end of Genesis, which reminds you, this is supposed to be the mirrored image of that. Yep. It's prophetic. You have Balaam. His poems are prophetic. When God turns his own words that was supposed to be cursed, he turned them into blessing, and there's prophetic pointing towards Jesus, which is super neat. And then you have Moses singing a song after they crossed the Red Sea. Yep. And that one's prophetic, and then this one here is prophetic, and I'm sure there's more, but those are the ones that just came up to mind really quickly. Yeah. So great.
More than I would have remembered. So we'll continue in verse 22.
Yes, do it.
For a fire is kindled by my anger, and it burns to the depths of Sheol. Devours the earth and its increase, and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains. And I will heap disasters upon them. I will spin my arrows on them.
So I was just going to say, sorry. The arrows so oftentimes will be used about disease and sickness. So arrows sometimes were used for disease and sickness. So think of it that way as you hear that.
Yep. They shall be wasted with hunger and devoured by plague and poisonous pestilence. I will send the teeth of beasts against them with the venom of things that crawl in the dust. Getting the plagues images of the plagues of
I was going to say the same thing, the strikes, the 10 strikes.
Yeah. Outdoors the sword shall bereave, and indoors terror. For young man and woman alike, the nursing child with the man of gray hairs. Meaning
there's no escape. You can't escape it inside or outside.
Young and old.
Young and old, in or out, there's no escape. Wow.
Yeah, that's depressing.
Yeah.
Verse 26, I would have said, I will cut them to pieces. I will wipe them from human memory. And I want to say, I'm reading from the ESV here, English Standard Version. But in the Complete Jewish Bible, there's a but here that starts with verse 27. But I'll continue in the ESV. Had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant. It is not by the God, or it is not the Lord who did this.
Man, there's such good stuff here.
Yeah.
I lost where I was here. This right here is, you're supposed to imagine that Israel, so far in the Pentateuch, it's been about Israel, the chosen people, and the enemies, right?
Yep.
Here, it's about Israel as the enemy. I mean, are you getting that language here?
Yeah.
It's like, for the first time, it's like Israel, anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself because there's another section here that will point, I think it will help with this, but just start thinking about that.
Yeah.
For the first time throughout everything, Israel's been set apart. They may not have been perfect. They may have fallen short, but God has been with them, and he's always had this remnant, right? This righteous remnant throughout, and it's been Israel and the enemies, right?
Push pin that thought too, because it'll be my contention that the entirety of Luke 11 today is about that very thing, about his people as the enemy.
Let's keep push pinning. Let's keep going.
Verse 28, picking up. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end. How could one have chased 1,000, and two have put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them, and the Lord had given them up? This is saying Israel's small, but they're chasing these bigger armies and bigger people groups away, right?
Yep.
Verse 31, for the rock is not as our rock. Our enemies are by themselves. For their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison. Their clusters are bitter.
Right? You're supposed to have, the vines are supposed to be from Eden, are supposed to be about life and abundance, but they're not. These people's vines are from the vines of Sodom. That's crazy.
And they're bringing poison, which is death.
Which is death. Mm-hmm.
Verse 33, their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of asps. Have a serpent in the garden allusion there as well.
It is, yeah. It's supposed to have that same, I was going to keep going, but serpent. You said it exactly the same way. I don't know what I was going to say differently.
Verse 34, is not this laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasures? Vengeance is mine and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and their doom comes swiftly.
So you're basically thinking, man, there's no hope.
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to do, right?
Yeah, I'm like, nobody's getting out of this alive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as you're reading this, mind you, Moses is writing this poem for what reason?
So that Israel would remember later.
Yeah. So imagine being the next generation reading this. You feel like there's no hope.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
This is it almost feels like this is their national anthem. Can you imagine?
Right?
We're talking about bombs bursting in air with our American anthem.
Yeah.
This is kind of a different tone.
It is, and it's about to shift. There's one little shift here. I think this is so great. 36 is great.
For the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants.
What? Hold on.
Yeah.
Wait a second. Give me a second.
Where did that come from?
Where'd that come from, right? Here's interesting about 36. At the very beginning of this poem, he's saying Israel. This whole thing is about Israel. It's about Israel. But it seems as if there are some that he will vindicate as his people and as his servants. Remember that. His people, his servants. I believe it's Isaiah. Isaiah, I think he's living in the middle of this violence, right? This violence that everything we've read thus far and what we're about to read, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself because we're about to read some more violence, okay? Isaiah's in the middle of that, but yet Isaiah is him and this small group of prophetic group of people, they have they are, what's the right word when you are, they had their tongues burned and they're
mute?
Not blessed. The word's not coming to me. But they were, but there's a small group of people, and from then on, the rest of the book Isaiah to the end of Isaiah, he calls them his disciples or he calls them his servants. And so I think we're supposed to imagine there are still a few remnants when there felt like there was no more hope for Israel.
Yeah.
This is Israel versus Israel right here, but there's a few. There's a few that will choose to be his and will be his servants.
God will always have his remnant.
There will always be a remnant. And here it is. In verse 36, you have that little spark of hope. It doesn't last long because there's a major turn that's about to happen.
Let's see.
37.
Then he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge? Who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offering? Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your protection. So he's saying all those gods you thought you were going to follow and that you were whoring yourself after, let them help you now.
The word I was looking for a second ago is purified.
Okay.
For the life, don't you hate that?
Yeah.
As soon as I gave up on the word and I looked down, the word purified popped in my head, and I was like, of course. Now I thought of it.
At least we connected that.
They were purified, and they were then kind of called their servants. And so it's interesting. Isaiah will pick up. When we read it, when you read it for the first time, you're thinking this is new. This is not a new concept for Isaiah. He's taken it from here. So sorry.
Verse 39. See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me.
Oof.
I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. And there is none that can deliver out of my hand.
Yeah.
For I lift up my hand to heaven and swear as I live forever.
So he's looking up to heaven and he's making his own oath. So think of kind of like Balaam, right? Balaam would look up to the heaven and he would make an oath. He would swear something. God is actually making his own oath here. So that's what he's doing in this next section.
Verse 41. If I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh, with the blood of the slain and the captives, with the long-haired heads of the enemy. Verse 43.
That's war language.
Yeah, it is. I was just thinking that.
War language.
That to me is a very mad Lord God.
Yes. Yeah.
Verse 43, rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's lands.
Okay, this is the last. This is really big part right here. This is important. You had one thing that you said. Do you want to say it? Because I have something too.
Yeah, so in the Complete Jewish Bible, which translates more of what they call the Masoretic text of the old Hebrew scriptures, what they would call it, it's what we call the Old Testament. They're the Hebrew scriptures. That translation doesn't have that line about all gods. It basically just talks about sing out, you nations, about his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. So a lot of this sense of the sons of God and the heavens is combined with the nations in the Masoretic text to say that this is the dimension that we're talking about, and this is what God is trying to get to, and it's combining the earthly and cosmic with the heavenly historic dimensions of God's activity.
Perfect. So I picked up the same thing. The word in Hebrew really actually means, instead of "oh heaven," it means nations. Mm-hmm. So what it's supposed to, and it says "oh nations," and it says bow down to the servants. So what servants? The ones we just talked about in verse 36, right? Those are the ones, those few remnants, right? And then it says at the very last verse, it says, and cleanse his people. What people? The people that were mentioned in 36. Yeah. So what's interesting here is the nations. It says, rejoice, O nations. Everyone should be rejoicing that God has chosen a remnant, his people and his servants. He has a few. And those few, because God has chosen them, he's chosen the few to now bless all. Yeah. Those nations shall rejoice, because it's because of those few that they too will be blessed.
And have life.
Yeah. If they choose it.
Yeah. Yep.
If they choose it. Here it is. That is about as prophetic as it can get. How much, this last section here of the war language and this last remnant of people, it is so, to me, it is so end times. Mm-hmm.
Revelation. This is Revelation language.
This is Revelation language here, and they will bow down. The nations will rejoice because of the few, the remnants that were left, and that will, though they have an opportunity one more time to give themselves over to the true God, the one King.
Wow.
This is
one more chance.
One more chance.
Yeah.
This is what it's talking about. I don't know about you, but that's the first time we've ever read. Mm-hmm. And like that. I hope that was amazing for you. I know that today's podcast might be a little bit long, but we can't do justice without jumping to Luke.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Luke 11.
We may not be able to spend as much time as we would wished, but I really thought today would be doing that was helpful, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
I agree.
Okay.
It was helpful for me, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I loved it. So, Luke 11. Go ahead and start us off.
Luke 11, of course, starts with Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer in verses 2 through 4. And of course, we've seen the Lord's Prayer before in Matthew's Gospel in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a longer one, but here we have Luke's shorter version. And we're not going to spend much time on the Lord's Prayer itself. There's a lot of great courses that do that, and we don't have time, as Amber just said, anyway. But if you're interested in a deeper course to really break down what both Matthew and Luke are saying in their Lord's Prayer, N.T. Wright does a fantastic job. I actually taught a Sunday school class on this last year based on his course on the Lord's Prayer. But we'll put a link to that course in the show notes. But I would highly recommend it because it really talks about what Jesus is getting at with each phrase of the Lord's Prayer and how they all tie back to some aspect of the Old Testament. There's so much Old Testament language and concept that Jesus pulls forward in the Lord's Prayer. And N.T. Wright does a masterful job of playing that out. But actually, Luke does a masterful job in the rest of this chapter of showing us what the Lord's Prayer looks like lived out. Jesus is going to teach on it in verses 5 through 14 or so. And then when he starts casting out demons in verse 14 of chapter 11 through the end of this chapter, you're going to see various aspects of the Lord's Prayer lived out.
That's good. When I read this, I was like, wait, that doesn't sound like the Lord's Prayer I've heard. Yeah. And so I did some little research on it. And, some people will try to give Luke a hard time, or say, the Bible has some errors, right? Yeah. Contradicts itself, it has errors. And the thing is let's think about it. Jesus is a traveling preacher, right? I do a lot of speaking myself. When you have a topic that you teach on, you have your general topic. In every audience that you speak to, you speak it a little differently. You read the audience. Maybe because of in what setting.
Yep.
But it's the same material. It would be silly to think that Jesus only said the Lord's Prayer one time at the Sermon on the Mount and that was it. He's probably said it dozens and dozens of times.
He was an itinerant preacher going from town to town,
That's right.
city to city.
He's doing the same similar preaching, right? And so I believe that this is probably just a different account. Luke is probably just saying, Matthew's like, I'm going to reference the one that he did here in the Sermon on the Mount with that audience. Luke is saying this is a totally different time when a disciple asked him a very specific question, and Jesus responded to that person with the same prayer slightly differently because of the audience.
And I think Luke is always, he's a literary master. He's always doing something with the way he arranges the stories. These are all true stories about Jesus and what happened, but Luke also arranges things to communicate the story, one, to a Gentile audience to help them understand, but also to help unfold the themes of Jesus' life and where they want to go theologically with what Jesus accomplished. So here, I didn't have time to do this study, but I would not be surprised if every aspect of Luke's version of Lord's Prayer is acted out, played with in various aspects of Luke's gospel.
Yeah, I would. I don't know either, but I bet you're right. One of you guys find that out for us and let us know. Maybe you guys.
Somebody's homework.
Someone do homework and say yes or no. That was correct. That'd be awesome. That'd be super great. Okay, I'm going to give us one more topic. We can choose the topic of when he healed the demons, or we can do the woes. Which one would you like to do? It's on you.
Let's do the woes.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah.
We'll finish up with that.
So Jesus comes in and starts interacting with the Pharisees, and he picks up on the woes at the end of the chapter, getting very specific with the Pharisees and then with the lawyers of the Torah. And they admit it. They are offended by this, right? And then they start to get together afterwards, the lawyers and the Pharisees, to try to figure out how to bring Jesus down. But Jesus is calling back to the woes that he started generically on the Sermon on the Plain earlier in the Gospel of Luke, and applies them specifically to the Pharisees and to the lawyers. And here we hear echoes within Jesus' woes of the prophets, like Moses in Deuteronomy that we just have been reading the last few weeks. Also in Amos and in Micah. We see here that Jesus is telling them, you're doing the small stuff, but you aren't paying attention to the big stuff that God cares about. You're not taking care of justice, and you're ignoring mercy, and you're not really living out the love of God, which is the love of neighbor. And this is a kingdom of God's stuff that Jesus is trying to get through to the current generation. It's almost like, this is my paraphrase, this is not a direct quote of Scripture, I want to make that clear, but it's almost like he's saying, you were supposed to be my partners and help me put the world back together. But instead, you have joined the enemy and you're ripping this world apart. And so this whole section is about Jesus announcing judgment. The woes are coming, judgment's coming. But even so, and at the same time, he's on his way to Jerusalem to take on that very judgment himself.
Oh, that's beautiful. Judgment is coming. Jesus is going to take it upon himself anyways.
Yep. And that's the gospel.
That's the gospel. Y'all, this was an incredible week. I hope and pray that it was fruitful and that you will get a lot from this week. We are praying for you. We pray for you each day as you are doing this journey with us. We know you're there with us. We'd love for your comments. We'd love your prayers back, actually, as we prepare and we help give you some insights. You pray for us as well. We really appreciate that. And remember, Jesus is a full story that all points back to Jesus, and that is the whole point of why we're doing what we're doing. So bring someone alongside with you.
Yep.
Bring someone in. Hey, let me tell you about what I've been learning in the Bible. And I just encourage you to do that this week and for the weeks going forward. And we hope you have a great week.
Amen. Bye, y'all.
Bye.